Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Sunday Shot after our post-election week off. It is great to be here. I am broadcasting from the unceded lands of the mighty Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. You'll see there's no Dave here today. I'm sorry for those of you who have tuned in specifically to hear the comments of Mr. Milner, but he is off on a working holiday in Europe. He will be beaming in next week from Amsterdam. I think he still will be in, unless he's moved on to Berlin or somewhere equally exciting by then. But in order to compensate for Dave's absence, we have lined up a really terrific panel for you, starting with friends of the show, RedBridge's Alex Fein. Hello, Alex. This is your first time as a panellist, but you're well known to our viewers. So welcome on a Sunday morning.
Thanks, Joe. Good morning.
Other friend of the show, who was our guest on our technical problem-plagued first show ever. So she's back for a much smoother show this time, we hope. Rachel Withers.
Hi, Joe. Hopefully I'm not the person who brings the technical bad luck.
No, we'll certainly blame you if anything goes wrong.
Yeah, you should, yeah.
And first-time Sunday Shot panellist, who will be no stranger to most of our viewers, I'm sure, is Leo Puglisi from Channel 6 News. Leo, welcome.
Yeah, good to be here. Probably will be my tech issues in the end is what I'm betting.
You are showing us all up with your fabulous wardrobe. We are much more in weekend mode, but for Channel 6 News, there is no such thing as a weekend. So welcome to all three of you. We are delighted to have you here on the Sunday Shot. Now, let's get straight into it because there's a lot to talk about. I think now, with a very few exceptions, we know the results of most of the seats with the election. We kind of know now what the shape of our parliament is going to be. We know what the shape of the new ministry is going to be. Lots to talk about there too. So we know what happened. So what I'm interested now today is talking about why it happened and what are the implications for what happened. So, Alex, we're going to throw to you first because you've always got such fabulous insight from the qualitative research that you have done into the Australian community. What have you learned about why we got the result that we did 2 weekends ago, or 2 weeks ago now?
So I think there's been so much commentary around the enormity of the landslide, and there have been inferences that have been drawn that I think are potentially problematic. The idea that there is this huge groundswell of support for Labor, and that there is an overwhelming desire among the Australian people for Labor to exercise whatever its mandate is. I think that's illusory. If you look at the primary vote, the others, so whether that's minor parties, whether that's independents, they had a very substantial primary vote. And the most important thing to remember also that what we were finding, not just in the qualitative research, but also in the quantitative research, was right up until the very end how soft the vote was. It could have gone in so many different directions. People were, for quite a while, very open to Peter Dutton, but that's because they didn't have any definition around him. But as the campaign went on and the Liberal campaign kept running into pretty serious trouble, there was this kind of growing sense from people that this was not a viable option. But really importantly, the Trump effect was massive. People were very worried about what they were seeing in terms of the instability and the extremism of what was going on in America, and they did not want to import that into Australia. Meanwhile, the Liberals were still pitching to an electorate that hasn't existed since Howard's time. A lot of those people are no longer with us. We have a lot more Gen Z, millennial, and diverse people from diverse backgrounds in the electorate. So they were talking to a lot of people who don't exist or people who exist in their imaginations. I think there was a Liberal conception of the bless you, of the outer suburbs. The Liberal conception of the outer suburbs was really just off. They imagined that, this is a hotbed of basically racism, narrow-mindedness, all that sort of thing, and it's just not the case. What most people are, whether that's outer suburban, middle ring, regional, inner city, is disengaged. So as long as people were disengaged from the political process, not the political issues, as I've kind of mentioned in the past, they were open to all sorts of possibilities. But then as the media environment kind of converged on, boy, the Liberals don't seem to have any policies, boy, the Liberals seem not to be doing very well, boy, they really seem to be emulating Trump. Even though the disengagement was there was an informational aggregate that was able to cut through. People kind of got this vibe of coordinated information coming through to them that the Liberals were not viable. And so what happened was a lot of people went to Labor as a safety option, whereas in the past they might have thought to vote minor party or Greens. They may have been more inclined to vote Labor. And also we saw the vagaries of the preferential system depress the Liberal vote, which in certain seats like Griffith and Brisbane meant that the Greens couldn't get up. So that's my nutshell of it all.
I mean, it's sort of interesting because there's a couple of things that sort of stand out in that analysis for me, and some of which we've talked about before on the show, that it is so extraordinary that after Dutton's extended political career, where he's been a high-profile minister and then leader of the opposition, that he was still relatively ill-defined in the minds of a lot of the electorate. And then secondly, and I think this will be to a certain extent written out of some of the history, is that oversized impact of Trump. And I think everybody understood that during the campaign, but we're already starting to see a drift away from that as a headline issue, and it be much more about the nimbleness of Labor and the appallingness of the Liberal or the coalition campaign generally. Leo, what was your and your viewers' take on it as the campaign went on? Does that really resonate with you and the younger viewers, this notion that it was a rush back to safety and security with Labor rather than an embrace of Albanese and the government more broadly? Leo? Yep, sorry, Leo. If you want to
Okay,
jump
good.
in there.
Sorry, it's cut off at the start. I was realising
sorry,
who it's directed
yes,
to.
Leo,
All good.
that
I heard the question. Yeah, definitely. I think at the end of the day, the more people got to know about Peter Dutton, the less inclined they were to vote for him. I think that was pretty clear in terms of the polling direction. You look at when the actual campaign started compared to like December and January, where less people are thinking about politics in December and January, except maybe us. And you see clearly it just keeps going away from the coalition there. And so I think, yeah, people know Albanese. I think what we were saying is, I think Labor was just wanting people to go with the devil they know versus the devil they don't at that point. And look, while it wasn't by any stretch, we're not talking about a 50% Labor primary vote here, but for them to go up as a first-term government, considering where they were standing, and for the coalition not only to go down, but to lose that many seats, it's extraordinary. And so clearly, yeah, it was just that people knew Albanese, people didn't know Dutton, and yes, it was reflected a bit differently in some seats because you had independents and there were different circumstances, which we'll get into, I'm sure. But yeah, overwhelmingly, they just didn't know Dutton. And it goes back to the voice referendum. If you don't know, vote no. And people voted no on Dutton.
Which kind of came back to bite him as a slogan. Rachel, Ben Rowie had said on an interview that we did with him directly after the Western Australian election that even as the polls started to tighten up again and you saw the smallest of momentum shifts begin to happen back to Labor, that it really posed a major problem for the political strategy or the electoral strategy that the coalition had really gone all in on, which was leave the inner city seats to the Teals and focus on that outer suburban ring where they thought they could mine this sort of reactionary, if not racist, illusory suburbia that Alex just referred to. So it was a pretty massive miscalculation on the part of the coalition in the end.
Yeah, and it baffled me all along throughout the term as Peter Dutton was trying to pivot to the outer suburbs and trying to be, at some point he claimed to be the party of the workers. And, obviously we saw the polls tighten and for a while there, it looked like the outer suburbs might have been in trouble. But I'm just not sure that the coalition can ever really speak to those voters. I'm still confused by how they think they can claim to speak for the working class while everything they stand for being against the working class. I mean, I think they were banking on people not really understanding or just being angry enough at the government to turn to them. But I don't think there were really any policies that were actually going to speak to those people in the mortgage belt, in the outer suburbs. And I think it'll be really interesting to now see if the Liberal Party, as it has another tussle over the future, a battle for the soul of the party, whether they try to return to their, well-off inner city base, or if they somehow double down on this idea that they can somehow win the working class without actually doing anything for them. It'll be interesting to see who wins out there. But the demographics are not in their favour in either of those seats, whether it's sort of migrant communities out in the outer suburbs or socially progressive young people in the inner city. Neither of those groups are voting for them, and they're growing.
That's right. I mean, George Meglogenis makes the point in his quarterly essay previously, but also updating it now in kind of commentary, that a lot of those outer suburban areas are populated by second-generation migrants who are living very different lives from their parents, in the sense that a lot of them are tertiary educated and they've moved out there for sort of more space and to raise families. But the issues around being a migrant, integration, being accepted and welcomed within a community are very important to them. And so the kind of racist undercurrent that existed in the coalition was never going to be that appealing to them. And then we saw that play out, obviously, and most markedly with the Chinese Australian community and all of the effort that had apparently gone in to trying to woo them back, which was then sort of blown up in the last sort of few weeks of the campaign. Alex, was that anything that you kind of picked up as well in terms of the way that kind of diaspora communities and second-generation migrants were responding to the coalition?
Yes, absolutely. We had one focus group participant who explicitly said, if I were voting on purely economic lines, of course I'd vote Liberal, but I can't because I'm scared of them, basically. And what was really interesting was that people who were themselves second generation or even Anglo-Australians were often aware of the deportation of dual citizens thought bubble and the referendum on that.
Yeah, right.
That cut through for a number of people, and I was quite surprised about it. They were horrified. It offended their sense of decency. And it was just part of this broader miscalculation. And interestingly, the positive kind of offerings from the major parties kind of confused people. People couldn't really attribute one housing policy to one party or the other. But the negative stuff they knew was coming from the Liberals, and there was something for everybody. There was the work from home, which upset a lot of people, including people in the outer suburbs who rely on work from home in order to kind of make ends meet. If they had to commute, it wouldn't be viable for them. Cutting the public service. the nuclear issue freaked so many people out. There was, again, something for everybody in the Liberal offering, just not in a good way.
Well, the Liberals really are going to have a whole world of pain over the next little while and potentially 3 years as they try and sort through who they are. I mean, lots of people saying fighting over the soul of the Liberal Party will be difficult because they have no soul. But if one puts aside that for the time being, we saw this week leadership questions being resolved, at least for now, by three of the kind of losing parties, if you like, starting with the Liberals. Now, the Liberals, it was interesting, they allowed both Giselle Kaptarian and Tim Wilson to vote because both of them, and look, let's be honest, probably both of them will in the end hold those seats. But it has been fun over the last week to see those margins tightening. And, yeah, well, we'll know, I think, tomorrow about both of them for sure. There's hopes of votes flying back in from Dubai and perhaps saving Zoe. Looks like Leo will be heading to a recount, though, in Bradfield automatically, and Zoe will have to have some creative reasons to perhaps secure a recount in Goldstein.
Yeah, we called this for the Liberals this week. Our projection remains the same, and well, it's Maggie Perry's calls really, but I stand by him completely. I think though Bradfield's going to be really interesting. It was always going to be one to watch after the North Sydney abolition, because it's like, where do these votes go, and it's all about redistribution, and it's all about I guess the notional teal numbers, quote unquote, in the Parliament, because you had Kylie Tink gone, and so I think if it's close, I mean, look, we're getting a recount no matter what, but it really can't be that good of a result for the Liberal Party. You have to remember, like 2 election cycles ago, these things were on like primary votes of 60% or something like that, right? 2 elections ago. That's not, I mean, maybe for my lifetime, it's a relatively long time away, but it really has not, it really has not been that far. So I think it's pretty extraordinary to see that. Interesting, the Goldstein result, and the fact that, and yeah, I know it's pending, but we still called it. Yeah, that Zoe Daniel has lost that. Again, there have been redistribution factors, but just still really interesting that Tim Wilson was able to get it back as a former member coming back. That's not something you really see that often in modern federal politics. So the fact he was able to get it back, got a swing towards him, was really significant. And of course, you had Monique Ryan in my seat of Kooyong, able to hold on. Got a bit tight towards the end. I think relatively comfortable the count seems to be for her now. And again, there are some redistribution factors into that. But look, at the end of the day, results are results. So redistribution or no redistribution, that's what they get.
A win's a win. I mean, Goldstein was kind of fascinating, Rachel, because as Leo says, a former member coming back, but not just a former member. I mean, Tim Wilson, for God's sake.
Yeah, there's not many made like Tim Wilson.
No, I mean, I would have thought, I thought that was a terrible decision by the Liberal Party to run him. The only kind of teal seat, actually, that's not true. I think McKellar was also, but one of the only seats in which they weren't running a kind of a professional, fabulously credentialed woman. And I thought, wow, they're doing him a bit of a favour. I mean, it was a very nasty campaign down there, and there was a lot of, particularly from Wilson, I think, but was also happening in Kooyong, exploitation of the October 7 and all of the issues around Israel and Gaza, very cynically used from the look of it by both the Liberal Party and a lot of the kind of front organisations for the Liberal Party that we get into in a minute as well. So, I mean, that could have been a factor for the pro-Israel members of the Jewish community down in those seats.
Yeah, look, I also thought when Tim Wilson was pre-selected that it was a terrible idea, because I had been paying really close attention to who the Liberals were selecting to run against these incumbent teal independents. And Tim Wilson, it's worth noting, did beat two quite well qualified women for the pre-selection. He just wanted it so badly. That's just a fact. And I had a bit of a look at his victory, but potentially a little preemptively, because it was before before it started to narrow. But when he claimed victory, he gave up work for 3 years. He, dedicated his whole life to winning this seat back. He is trying to tell this story of running his own community-style campaign. That's the story he's trying to weave to the Nine papers, especially. He appeared in the AFR and the Age, sort of suggesting he knew how to win back these seats by emulating a Teal independent campaign, or a community independent campaign, I should say. The story coming from those on the ground is a little different, that it was really, really quite a nasty, vicious campaign run by Wilson. I think there'll be probably many reports and deep dives on what he did, but I think he wants to claim that he represents a new way to win back these seats. He wants to say, I am the one who knew how to do this. I can help you kind of reclaim the heartland. If it's going to look like that every time, I think that's... I don't think they'll be winning back the ones in Sydney anytime soon. But if it's going to look like that every time, I think we should be deeply, deeply alarmed, because it wasn't nice from what we're hearing. And Wilson himself, I think is going to play a very interesting role in the Liberal Party's attempt to redefine itself now that he's in there. I almost wonder if he pulled out of the leadership battle because he could see the numbers. Goldstein were the problem for him.
Yeah.
But, he defines himself as a moderate. I wouldn't define him as a moderate myself. But if he's going to be the moderate direction the Liberal Party takes, this is someone who has held quite climate denialist positions in the past. Well, not necessarily denialist, but he's been against climate action. When he was at the IPA, he argued for Australia to pull out of the Kyoto Protocol, to abolish the Climate Change Authority. He is not the kind of moderate that they need if they're going to take a truly moderate direction, but he's certainly going to be, I think, making his presence very, very well known to all of us and to everyone in the Liberal Party.
Well, look, that is the thing, and I think the closeness of Susan Lee's victory, I think, is telling. There was sort of hilarious commentary that if, in fact, Bradfield and Goldstein did end up falling or staying with, going to Teals, and then with 3 of Susan Lee's supporters, outgoing senators, that actually from July 1, Taylor would have the majority, or if he sought to run again. I think it is, we won't get into too much analysis of the glass cliff, but certainly Susan Lee is now promoting her victory as a demonstration that the Liberal Party have heard, that they need to go back to the sensible centre. But at the same time, it's really only Dutton who has ever before managed to be the one elected after a terrible election defeat and then hang on as opposition leader to still be there when the next election comes around. So the chances of Susan Lee actually being the leader of the Liberal Party by the time they get to the next election is probably remote, with the exception that, as with Dutton, who else are they going to go with? The idea that Angus Taylor could be the opposition leader seems to me just ridiculous.
Well, Andrew Hastie has already been out since pulling out of the vote and saying now's not my time, but he's already come out and done interviews and made it clear that he wants it later, at a more opportune time, perhaps.
Yeah, and I put money on him, actually, which, of course, I lost because then I think the day after that, he said, I will not be a candidate. So there we go. My partner has banned me from actually betting on any more political outcomes because I keep losing. Although I will say I was horrified because at the 2020, was it, election, they didn't pay out on the Democrats holding the Senate even though they did hold the Senate, because Bernie Sanders is not technically a Democrat. So I thought that was unfair.
Well,
But
I'm still waiting on my Jackie Lambie money to come through from this
Well,
election. It's taking
yeah.
ages for them to finish that count.
that really has. I was looking into the Senate, and whilst it looks like Jackie will hold on, it was a bit of a scare.
Looks
and then,
like it, but it's
Yeah, it's not been called yet. And some people are putting that down to Salmon, and that whilst Salmon played very well for Peter George in Franklin, not quite well enough to get him over the line, it actually played badly for Jackie Lambie at a state level. Alex, did you talk to anyone?
Can I just...
Sorry, yeah, go, Leo.
I was just going to say with Lambie, I mean, I think the Lambie kind of shine has worn off in Tasmania. The state election last year was a disaster in terms of getting 3 seats and 2 of them gone within like 3 months or something like that. They've got 1 MP and they won't even contest him at the next election. You know, he'll run as some independent. At the end of the day, if Lambie holds on, I still think it is an if. She is, you know, in a severely reduced situation with negotiation. I think, you know, you wouldn't put her as a favourite to get back in when's her term expire? 2031.
Well, I think she's announced this would have been her last term.
Right there. See, so it's like it's almost lame duck there. I mean, it's the party itself has just had all these opportunities to go national. They have not been able to. I think their best result was 2.7, and that was with Rex Patrick in SA, outside of Tasmania, that is. And you've got Tammy Terrell, who's still there, and look, I'm sure she'll run in 2028, and she won't get in either. But yeah, I think it's been an interesting. Some would call it an experiment with the Lambie network, but I think, yeah, it's clearly done after this election.
But the question is who gets that 6th spot in Tasmania if Lambie's finished and Tyrell can't get re-elected. You know, there's still that 6th spot. You know, One Nation had a real crack down there in Tasmania this election with Pauline Hanson's daughter, Lee, who I think also took some votes off Jackie Lambie. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens down there next, because there is always that 6th spot that's a bit of a wild card.
Yeah. And I think the Greens are very much angling to get that 6th spot as well. I mean, I think it's kind of understated how good their vote is in Tasmania. I think, yeah, watch this space. I think, you know, if there's an election in 2020, and what do you mean if there's an election in 28, but at the 2028 election, I think, you know, it's not improbable to think Tassie could be like 1 Labor, 2 Liberal, 3 Greens, 4 Labor, 5 Liberal, 6 Greens. I think the Greens are very much angling. You remove the Lambie vote, because at the end of the day, regardless of what you think of Lambie's positions, her voters are like all over the page, right? They're everywhere, and they could flow anywhere. So that'll be interesting. I think, yeah, Greens, really, 6 seaters anywhere between Greens, Majors, and One Nation in Tassie post Lambie.
Maybe legalised cannabis will run with it.
I'm
angling for legalised cannabis to get up somewhere in a national level. Before we move on from the Lib, well, actually, it's probably a segue into a quick chat about the Nats. Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, what was that about? Has she kind of blown her opportunities really for a major role on the front bench now? She clearly sort of jumped ship. She'd said that she had always wanted to sit in the Liberal Party room, and to be fair, notionally the Country Liberal Party members can sit in either room, but by convention, certainly the senators have always sat with the Nats. The Nats have been the ones who supported her and her political career until she became a useful idiot for Dutton during the referendum campaign. She thought she had a shot at being deputy leader when it was clear that, well, when Taylor was defeated, she decided not to even run, which apparently did attract the ire of some of her supporters. What that means now for her role on the front bench will be interesting. Any takers on how that might play out? Is she, going to be one of those, as Paul Keating said, they dazzle brightly, Bronwyn Bishop style, and then they kind of collapse, and any notional leadership ambitions that she has are laughable. Alex, any thoughts on Jacinta?
So I think the most interesting thing, in a sense, for me, is the distance between the pundit class's assessment of her genius as a retail politician versus hearing anything from anybody anywhere in the country, right? During the Voice campaign, there were people who would make reference to sort of Indigenous people who didn't like the Voice, and that was why maybe the Voice was problematic. That was the closest thing that I heard to anyone having any sort of name familiarity with her. She doesn't cut through. She's not the retail politician that people describe in the way that someone like Jackie Lambie is. So it's really interesting to listen to the analysis from Leo in terms of, again, the distance between the people who actually are tasked with voting for Lambie versus her national profile, where people will kind of often cite her as an example of a politician who they can tolerate as opposed to everyone else. That was never the case with Price. Never heard her name ever.
Yeah, well, I don't think she's winning any popularity awards, Rachel.
I was going to say that may be the case, and that is so interesting to hear, but she remains an absolute darling of Sky News. I think that they will keep promoting her and keep trying to get her into one of the top jobs until they achieve it. You know what they're like when they have a goal. I mean, she's exactly what they want. She's fulfilling the exact kind of Trumpian model for the Liberal Party that they want to see it take. And yeah, that's who the Liberal members are listening to, is Sky News. So I think she's going to play, again, a big role in this battle for the soul of the party. And, we'll see. I'm paying a lot of attention to what the genuine moderates are saying this week and just how hard they are fighting for the party of Menzies. And the "We Believe" statement and things like that. I don't see how they win it, though. I don't see how the moderates get their way when they just don't have the numbers in the membership or in the party room or the platform of News Corp.
And that is what's interesting. I saw Tony Barry talking about this, and the party membership is also very influenced by Sky News. So that flows into the pre-selections. And whilst they could get people like Giselle Captarian in as a kind of captain's pick because it was so late that Paul Fletcher decided not to run, which he might be kicking himself now about. But if Sky News continues to exercise this oversized influence on the Liberal Party and indeed the coalition generally, then they are doomed, maybe not just for one or two electoral cycles, but beyond. The Nats, of course, were you going to chip in there, Roach?
Oh, I mean, I could talk about moderate Liberals all day, so I will let us move on.
Well, no, let's move on to look, the Nats, I mean, Canavan had a shot. They're all talking about withdrawing support from net zero and possibly withdrawing support for an actual formal coalition agreement, people like Bridget McKenzie and so on. I think that's probably just a bit of sound and fury for now. Leo, any thoughts on the Nats and the coalition?
Yeah, speaking of my national sources, there's no realistic expectation it's going to happen, not at least in the discussions they're having at the moment. The reason it's kind of being thrown out there is, probably just to get a better negotiating position. As David Littleproud has said, he was able to get the Nationals an extra shadow cabinet spot, which was reserved for Jacinta Price. So much for that. Whether they kind of build up from there. But look, they're clearly unhappy. They got the short end of the stick in the New South Wales Senate ticket by being third below two Liberals, and you'd think it'd be one Lib, one Nat, one Lib, one Nat, but it wasn't. And then Perrin Davies gone. And not that I don't think it was anything like arrogance. Their numbers in New South Wales were never assured of a third Senate seat by any stretch. No one's assured of a third Senate seat. It's always a gamble. So that was a problem for them. But look, at the end of the day, they were able to hold on in all the seats they held prior to the election. Clare, obviously, were not able to get back from Andrew G. Bendigo was very interesting how close they came there. But yeah, I think clearly they want to continue having a say, and I think they're going to be able to, regardless of what we're going to see in the negotiations, because the Liberal Party room is very, very small. it's small even when you include all the LNP members who sit with the Liberals, and so that'll be a persistent thing for them. Meanwhile, in the Senate, though, they're completely screwed in the Senate. I mean, they don't even have like official parliamentary party, major party status or something like that in the Senate anymore.
They don't.
They're
And that was one
small
of the
there.
reasons that they were so annoyed with Jacinta, because with the loss of the New South Wales Senate seat plus Jacinta jumping camps, that is what has meant that they've fallen down below major party status in the Senate. So talking of the Senate, that is where the Greens do have hope. Well, not just hope. That is where they're still going to be exercising a great deal of power. And, of course, their leader will be drawn from the Senate again with not really an election, was it? Because they all sit around and then agree that Larissa Waters was the best person for the job. And she is, I think, a very creditable person to have put forward to lead the party. Now, Alex, I don't imagine that she'll have much name recognition with anyone yet, but that will change. It was a blow, the loss of Adam Bandt, and very unexpected. They're putting it down to some of the vagaries of the preferential system that we've talked about before, and I think there is truth in that, even though people don't want to actually acknowledge that truth if you're in the major parties. But it will be interesting to see how they regroup now and what their strategy is moving forward to forge a different identity.
Indeed, I think there's been a lot of interesting advice being proffered from various quarters. Some people are telling them you must become far more radical and lean into the radicalism, and it's because you weren't radical enough, which is kind of almost a mirror image of Sky News' instructions to the Liberal Party. Then there is, the other side saying, oh, you really need to focus on the environment only. You've been far too radical.
Yeah.
And I think that's really problematic as well, because they had broadened their message in 2022 and it worked very, very well for them there. And if they are an environment-only party, then their ceiling is really 10%. And they don't have the geographic concentrations to win lower house seats on the back of that. So it keeps going back to what I keep finding in the qualitative research so strongly, which is when you present people with really progressive policies economically, that is what almost everybody wants, like really progressive structural reform, but they want it couched in really moderate language. Everyone likes to think of themselves as fair and balanced and, considering all sides of things. And when they feel that something is being presented in a partisan way, often they shut down because they're so overwhelmed by the contested spaces. So someone like Larissa Waters is actually really well positioned to deliver those progressive policies that the Greens do have in that way that the electorate says, like, it wants to hear, in that kind of collegiate way.
And it really was, I think, quite a conscious thing, Rachel, to go with someone like Larissa Waters as opposed to Marine Faruqi. But Larissa Waters, in her first sort of statements as leader, there doesn't seem to be any indication that she is stepping back from those positions. But the way that they are couched may be different. And also the strategy is very much a challenge to the government that in the Senate there are two pathways for them to pass their legislation. There is to do the dirty deals with the coalition who has just been rejected by the electorate, or to do deals with them in ways which will enhance progressive policy. And it's throwing down the gauntlet to a degree.
Yeah, I mean, because that is the facts of the case, is that the Greens, despite their, struggles in this election, and no one would call it a great result, but they do hold that balance of power. And I think it's interesting, Larissa Waters did make it clear, we're here to get things done in that opening press conference. And in a sense, I actually found her messaging almost exactly the same as Adam Bandt's was for the last 6 months or so, because I think there had been this shift from Adam Bandt to make it clear that they were there to collaborate, but also to push. And I almost don't think it matters what the Greens say. It's what the media decides to do with those words. You know, I think there was a real concerted effort by many parts of the mainstream media to suggest that the Greens were simply there to block, and that was Labor's argument as well. And the media picked it up and ran with it. You know, one of the I think the three key reasons that analysts who don't like the Greens are citing for the Greens' terrible result, where they still hold the balance power in the Senate, is blocking housing in the Senate, which, you know, I think a lot of people forget that housing was passed in the end, that the Greens extracted concessions. It took a long time, but that actually passed. And, you know, I've spoken to people in Melbourne who voted Labor, who want sort of what Alex is saying, you know, what the Greens offer. They want the Greens policies, but they don't see the Greens as the way to get it. People who would prefer to have a Labor majority. And a lot of those people don't realise that a lot of those things that the Greens were blocking ultimately did get passed. And of course, the Greens did pass a whole bunch of things in the final sitting of the final fortnight of Parliament sitting, in order to not have that held over them. But the narrative had set around, I suppose, Adam Bandt and Max Chandler-Mather in particular, that they were blockers, that they weren't collaborative. And let's see, I suppose, what the media chooses to do with Larissa Waters' leadership. You know, she can make the points that we are here to make things better and then pass them all she likes. But if the media decides that they're going to frame her as a blocker, it's hard for them to break through that narrative.
Can I quickly jump?
Sorry, no, go Leo, and I'll jump in after.
Alex.
Yeah, what I'll just add there is look, at the end of the day, the negotiating position of the Greens is the same as it was before the election, because Labor had a majority then, they've got a majority now, and the Greens had 11 senators then, and they've got 11 senators now. The difference is the numbers in the Senate make things, you know, a bit more, bit better for the Greens in terms of reduced impact of some others on the cross-bench, and also the coalition's numbers just being, you know, awful for them at the moment. Look, at the end of the day, as bad as the seat losses were, I think people have got to be really cautious in attributing this as a nationwide rejection of the Australian Greens. Their vote, as it stands, is going to be identical to 2022. I mean that in the most literal sense, like 12.2%, dead on identical. They're, again, as has been mentioned, and yes, they have lost primary vote by, you know, like 1 to 3% in some seats, in the seats they previously held. A lot of that, as has been mentioned, was literally just the factor of where the LNP and Labor end up, because Labor versus Greens and Labor versus and Greens versus LNP is a different beast. And then, of course, you know, look, in Melbourne, as you just said, Rachel, and, you know, I hear that because I'm near the seat of Melbourne, you know, Adam Bandt, I don't believe was ever particularly unpopular in his electorate. He clearly was, because he was an MP for 15 years.
Yeah.
The slogan Labor was using on their core flutes, and mind you, they were not running a giant campaign. They really did not expect to win Melbourne, but it was builder, not a blocker, and that's what they kept kind of pushing there. And look, there were some clear factors that cause this. Redistribution is one that I don't think it's like cope for Greens people to mention. It was a very clear factor in Melbourne in terms of Labor areas being added. Again, this kind of stuff happens. And again, look, it's a small primary vote, but look, I don't expect Larissa Waters to be particularly different in Adam Bandt's, policy-wise. Yeah, sure, maybe messaging will change somewhat. But I think that direction is clearly where it's working. She was very much the consensus candidate. Speaking to a lot of rank and file members as well, she was clearly the preferred option over the three main contenders, and I think, you know, for them it's probably the better option.
Alex?
Yeah, I think, you know, all the points that both Rachel and Leo made are absolutely spot on. The one thing I would add to that around that blocker thing is, again, that notion of the informational aggregate, because people in the groups would tell me about policy things that were pretty much identical to the Greens offering in terms of what they wanted, but they had absolutely no idea that the Greens were offering it. And even if the media had reported properly on that, they still wouldn't have known, because discrete informational units are not reaching people because of this trend to news avoidance. And what does cut through again is that informational aggregate. And so what happened with the blocker narrative was that there was this kind of almighty coordination in the media to kind of really push this idea that they're blocking housing. We don't have housing because of the Greens. That was able to cut through. So a challenge that the Greens will need to face now is how to coordinate information outside of those media spaces, because they're never going to be friendly, and anyway they're losing audience share.
Yeah.
How to coordinate information elsewhere, because there are so many sources, in order to reorient the narrative and to deal with a landscape where they won't be able to rely on the Liberal vote holding up in order to win certain seats. It's the new strategic reality, but it's also doable.
It's interesting. I mean, I think the Greens were trying that, Adam Band and Abby Chatfield's kind of great night out with Adam on the decks, that kind of thing. So it will be interesting to see. Now, of course, the community independents don't have the Senate balance of power to fall back on. They really had a mixed election, I think it's fair to say, not just because of the loss, probable, of Goldstein, but because they really failed to pick up any new seats. So it looks like Bradfield, although we've, as discussed, that's going down to the wire, but it looks like it will stay with the Liberals. So they haven't replaced the abolition of North Sydney, if you like, losing Goldstein and not picking up any of those seats where they had real hopes, particularly around, Wannon and Cowper. Where they did have some success, it was in seats that were largely missed as possible, and that was coming from the left. Kate Hewlett, who was a late candidate after the state election in WA in the seat of Fremantle, and of course Jessie Price in Bean. So Rachel, you've spoken to various independents and also interviewed Simon Holmes, the Court to Get Climate 200's perspective. What is your take on the new reality for the community independents and their possible strategy moving forward or moving through this term?
Yeah, look, I think the thing to note is all of the new ones missed out, but so many came so close. There's just an incredible number of seats where a couple of hundred votes would have made the difference. Although, as Simon Holmes Court said to me when I interviewed him about a week and a half ago, there are no silver medals in politics. At the end of the day, coming close doesn't actually cut it. But there are plenty of them that I reckon could have another go, and often these campaigns do take time to build. I do sort of feel that the existing ones, the ones that held on, with the exception of Zoe Daniel and Goldstein, were kind of the easy gets. Like, those are the seats that really, really fit the demographic of willing to turn to a progressive, sort of maybe centrist in some regards, independent. So it's about, I think this was a big experiment this time for so many community independents to be running in so many different seats on ever so slightly different platforms. I think it's a learning process, and some of them will be back, some of them might not. The independent I spoke to this week was Jessie Price in Bean, who came this is a seat in the ACT held by Labor. And I had a look. There was a set of community independents, a small set challenging Labor MPs, and ultimately those are the ones who've come the closest and just missed out. Jessie Price, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it was just, for a while there it looked like she was going to win it. And Kate Hewlett in Fremantle, who had run as the state candidate and then pivoted and almost, and she came so close there and then came so close at a federal level. I mean, I think those ones in particular show there is dissatisfaction with Labor and with Labor not going far enough. I mean, as Jesse Price pointed out to me, you know, Labor's claiming their primary vote held, but the fact that Labor is even on the nose in a place like Fein at all, the fact that they didn't get a swing to them shows people are not happy with Labor. So I think those ones will be really interesting to see come back. And I think the rest of them, you know, very, very disappointing for Nicolette Buller and Bradfield. Several other races ended up being three-way races with Labor, Liberal, Indie, where I think if the Indie had been able to come second over, a lot of them came in third just behind Labor, and Labor wasn't able to take the seat. But several of those Indies, if they'd come second and picked up the Labor preferences, would have turfed out the Lib. So that's a question of strategy, I think, for Labor. There's no coordination there. But, you know, maybe Labor shouldn't be running quite so hard in those seats. And look, maybe next election, if Labor's isn't so far above the Liberals in primary vote, maybe that will look a little bit different for those Indies. But yeah, it's a real sort of almost, it could have been so different, but for a few votes, but for the way the primaries fell in some seats.
Leo, your colleague Maggie had done some analysis of this as well, just to show across, what was it, like nearly 12 seats, as Rachel said, a few hundred votes could have actually transformed the landscape. But there's a few of those candidates who came very close who have said that they're not going to run again. I think Alex Dyson is one. I've heard rumours that Nick Buller has said if she doesn't get up, she won't run again. And some of them were already second or third time candidates. Kaz Heiss was her second go, Deb Leonard. But then there were some like Sue Chapman in Forest and Karen Jones in Fisher, where they were first timers and potentially will still have that energy and enthusiasm to run again. So it could have been very different, couldn't it?
Yeah, look, I expect, not from sources, just like personal expectation, any of the third placed independents who are first timers but managed to get at least third place, I would expect them to run again. I think they should. They've got a chance. Clearly, Jesse Price will. I think that makes the most sense. That margin is ridiculously small, ridiculously small against Labor. Same, of course, in Fremantle. What'll be interesting is that there's a state election in 2029 there, so plenty of opportunities there. I think really, it's a matter of just a few votes going a few ways. And look, of course, some of this is preference. I saw there's a comment in the chat asking, whether it was because LNP preference Labor over independents. Like, no, it's definitely not that, because it's independents versus LNP contests. So it's not that factor at all. And so, it's some interesting opportunities. Zoe Daniel, her future will be interesting. Again, I'm basing this off the assumption she does lose as we projected. And where she goes from here, again, more interesting because she is a former MP. The margins in Kooyong will obviously be a bit of concern for Monique Ryan, even if she did hold on. It was clearly a reduced margin. Some of this is redistribution factor. The New South Wales incumbents all did really, really well. Zali Stegel is locked into that seat for as long as she wants it, I reckon. Same with Central Alliance's Rebecca Sharkey in Mayo in South Australia. The margins there are just pretty extraordinary for independents. And mind you, Stegel would be on her third term, Sharkey on her fourth. So they've been there for a bit longer. But that'll be interesting, yeah. But, you got Kaz Heiss, who I believe she said she won't recontest. Alex Dyson, I think. Dan Team might have gotten a swing towards him there. That was really, really just, unfortunate campaign for him in Bradfield as well. Look, people wonder whether it was the hairdresser comment and things, because that race could go either way. And I think in the recount it could go either way. So we'll wait and see. But look, at the end of the day, as what happens a few times, but it's happening a lot more, it is really a matter of 100 votes, one way or another.
If I could just...
Oh, sorry, go on. Alex.
Sorry.
Alex?
No, just really briefly, the incumbent Teals and Zoe Daniels going to almost certainly lose her seat. They're grouped together, and what's so interesting in terms of looking at the closeness of the races in Melbourne versus Sydney, where there were similarly awful campaigns run, and Wentworth has a very high proportion of Jewish voters as well. What we've noticed in the research over the past few years is that the trend to news avoidance is particularly acute in Melbourne, which had this traumatic pandemic experience that was not quite as bad as Sydney. And so people tell us that the news upsets them more in Melbourne than it does in Sydney. So those kind of nasty AstroTurf campaigns were able to gain purchase in Melbourne in a way that they weren't in Sydney. And also there was a protective element in Sydney because of the more insular nature of those communities, particularly in the northern beaches. There is like really significant social cohesion, right?
Yeah.
And especially in a seat like Goldstein, things are much more diffuse. It's much harder to kind of reach people and get into community structures that often don't even exist.
Yeah, and I think that is the thing. I mean, Monique Ryan wrote about this in the Saturday paper yesterday as well, just the nastiness of the campaign, and we touched on this before. But the fact that this $5 million was being spent by these Liberal fronts, which included Jason Falinski headed Australians for Prosperity, Nuclear for Australia, Better Australia, IPA, Coal Australia, Keep the Sheep, Fuel Tax Credit Alliance, all of these were spending six-figure, sometimes approaching seven-figure, and cumulatively over $5 million on very targeted campaigns, and particularly those three seats that we've just touched on, Wentworth, Goldstein and Kooyong, but also anti-Greens up in Queensland as well. So, you know, I think the independents, it's not a clear-cut position. There's a big piece in the Sydney Morning, well, in the 9 papers this morning as well, that goes into some detail. Obviously, Rachel, you did for Crikey as well. So I think still watch this space for them. We're coming to the end of the show. We very deliberately haven't gone deep into the Labor Party today because we're going to have 3 years to do that. But before we go, we will just touch on the carnage in Cabinet. To some extent, I think this is a bit of a non-story in the sense this is Labor being Labor. And whilst I think it is, you know, a very bad look that you had the only Jewish and the then only Muslim member of Cabinet both being the ones who were axed, there is a bit of a sense of live by the sword, die by the sword. Dreyfus and Husic both got their positions in Cabinet because of factional patronage. So it is a little bit disingenuous then to turn around and talk about factional assassins. I was interested as well in Jason Katsoukis' story in the Saturday paper that actually, for all the notion of Miles being the one who was the assassin, Husic lost his position in a deal that was done months before the election when Shorten was retiring from politics. They said they wouldn't go, they would happily give up their 4th spot, and that ministry was abolished at the time. Amanda Rishworth took NDIS with help from Katie Gallagher, but that the deal was the 4th spot would come back to the right in Victoria. After the election, that was exacerbated because of the way, you know, the sheer volume of new people coming into the caucus meant that the left had more numbers, and in fact the Victorian right had more numbers, so they were going to hang on to that 4th seat. So actually the deal had been done that resulted in the New South Wales right losing one of their seats. And when you've got Chris Bowen, Tony Burke and Jason Clare and Ed Husic, it's kind of pretty clear to see who is likely to go. Leo, was that for you a bit of a non-story, or were you more in the Nikki Sava camp that why aren't they looking at merit and who is actually performing well rather than just exercising the sheer brutal force of numbers.
Yeah, I mean, it is at some level Labor being Labor because, I mean, they've had factions. This isn't an unknown thing that has suddenly popped up post-election.
No.
This is, for those who, had sources and people who were looking at factional numbers, and again, things were changed by the fact that Labor held on in a lot of these seats. It wasn't entirely unexpected, and so look, I expect it'll probably murmur around Labor. Maybe I don't think we're talking elbow spill territory by any stretch.
No, I think...
But it's just gonna murmur, and I think at the end of the day, look, people can say okay, they want merit, but that's not how it works. They've got the factions. The factions are the way the party has, at some level, yes, it's caused division, but it has at some level kept it together after what's it been, three spills in their history, 3 splits in their history. So look, it's how it works. This kind of stuff happens, and yes, it's unfortunate for Ed Husick, but it'll be interesting to hear what he can now say from the backbench without any cabinet constraints, and I look forward to hearing from him.
I mean, I think Albo did very successfully rise above the fray, even though, by all accounts, he's still very much the master manipulator and can't quite throw off his factional leader roots. There was a notion that certainly Ed Husick was promoting that some of this was to do with him being outspoken on Gaza. He talked about on Insiders last week that you can't want diversity and then have it sitting silently in the corner. Also some commentary that Albo was irked by the way that he spoke out about that issue. But in the end, Rachel, the cabinet is now majority women for the first time ever. And they have got some up-and-coming talent coming through now that is a direct result of some of this, with Dan Molino getting a Guernsey, but also in New South Wales we've seen Andrew Charlton enter the outer ministry, or assistant ministry, I think. So there has been this sense, Rebecca White coming up in Tasmania, that there is renewal happening, and that's a good thing, and we'll move on pretty quickly from the disappointment of Dreyfus and Husic.
Yeah, look, I mean, my one addition to the points that you and Leo have made there is it's interesting, I think, how much work has been going on in the media in the last few days of trying to calm this storm. You know, as you point out, that piece in the Saturday paper, the Victorian right sort of defending itself, saying we were not the factional assassins. There was quite a puffy piece in The Guardian about Sam Ray, who is the Victorian right MP who was elevated in this deal and who I think got the most ire because he's considered sort of like Richard Miles's factional right-hand man. And there was quite a puffy piece with a lot of people saying a lot of nice things about Sam Ray and how talented he is. Yeah. So it is interesting how much I think they are worried about Ed Husick's comments hurting them and wanting to make it clear that this was a deal done before the election and Sam Ray is actually really great.
Yeah,
and we'll see if there's an Isaacs by-election as well, and we'll see if Dreyfus calls it quits.
I think there will be, yes.
I would suspect so as well. And I mean, that's just... look, Labor realistically should hold that, certainly if it's being held so close to the federal election. But I mean, just in terms of having to organise pre-selection and run a whole other campaign, it's a disaster for them. The voters are going to be rightly pissed off about this, going back to the polls after 3 months, which is, I mean, arguably, at some level, and I get that he was pushed out, but arguably at some level it does reflect on Dreyfus. He's quitting immediately after being re-elected, potentially. He's quitting so soon, and so a lot in Labor just would not be happy about having to run another campaign. But we'll see if what they speculating, whether Paul Erickson gets shoved in or something like that.
Yeah, that's been the rumours. I mean, look, it has also been said that if Dreyfus knew he was going to be forced off the front bench, then he wouldn't have run again, and so this could have been handled better and allowed him in particular, as sort of an elder statesman, I mean, Ed Husick is a younger man, to retire with some dignity. But then,
of course, you can argue, he was still elected to serve a community. Forget the ministry, he's still abandoning them. And if we're talking about ifs and buts at this point, but we'll see.
Now, look, we'll reached the end of the show. As I say, there's going to be lots of time for us to talk about the government in the coming weeks, months and years. Next week we will have Dave coming in from Europe, so that will be fun. As ever, we have come back after the election, which we weren't sure that we would, so we would be very grateful to any of our viewers and listeners who are able to throw a few dollars our way to keep us on air, and to like and subscribe so the algorithms do their thing on our behalf. Before we go, I'm going to ask any of our panellists if they have a top tip that they'll be looking at for the week to come, or any recommendations, advice, or general issues they'd like to highlight. Rachel.
I'm changing mine from what I was going to say based on this last conversation, which is one thing I've been taking a look at is the anger in the Muslim community at Ed Husick's dumping. I mean, of course, he has suggested it partly had to do with his position on Gaza, but the Muslim Vote and Muslim Votes Matter, which are two groups that ran sort of campaigns in the election encouraging people to vote for Muslim independence over Labor in some very safe Labor seats, they didn't do great. They got incredible primary votes and some decent swings against Labor's primary. They didn't come close as expected. But if you take a look at their Instagram accounts, they have both put out statements, this Muslim Vote AU and Muslim Votes Matter, both put out statements condemning the Ed Husick dumping and saying that this is Labor again taking the communities for granted. And they've also got stats showing where they made an impact. So it's worth having a look if you're interested in how that community is taking that news.
That was a point Paul Keating made as well, in terms of having a senior Muslim cabinet minister who had spoken about these issues with such integrity and nuance as well. Leo, your top tip for the coming week?
Yeah, I just think watch for whatever One Nation is doing at the moment. They had an MP, another one quit last night in South Australia, Sarah Game, their only South Australian MP. What's interesting is her mother is the leader of One Nation South Australia, Jennifer Game. And Jennifer Game told me on 6 News like a month ago that she, as in Jennifer Game personally, if she ever decided to split with One Nation, she would leave Parliament instead of staying as an independent. Well, her daughter, who is under her leadership, is staying as an independent. So watch for what they're doing. They're probably going to get Malcolm Roberts up. Doesn't look like they'll get anywhere else. And the kind of, quote-unquote, people will call it what they want, right-wing nutjob, freedom movement, whatever partisan perspective you want on it. There are certainly moves to kind of unite around it, and that's something that One Nation has resisted, but they're looking like they might be setting up local branches for the first time in like 28 years. So whether you like them or not, they do have, they could be up for significant Senate power if they actually get it at the next election. So yeah, watch this space and see what they have to do.
Yes, I saw that they'd lost their only South Australian MP. There's been a bit of an exodus from parties in South Australia because Tammy Franks also recently resigned from the Greens, the long-term member of the Legislative Council there. Alex, final word to you.
Well, I'm always obsessed with what the people in the groups are telling me, so I want to be listening out for how they're feeling in the wash-up of the election and comparing it against what we saw after 22, because after 22 people were almost euphoric at having sort of dispensed with Morrison, and I want to compare that kind of that sense that you were getting so strongly from people with how they're feeling in the wash-up, and whether there is, optimism or whether there's resignation. I think that's going to be really instructive for how things play out in 3 years' time.
Yeah, not quite that euphoria sweeping the nation at this point. Well, look, thank you to the three of you, Leo, Alex, Rachel, for joining us, and Rachel's dog, who you can just see there in the bottom of frame. We couldn't let the show end without that shot. So thank you to the three of you for joining us. Thank you to all of our viewers, whether watching live or later on Catch Up. And we look forward to seeing you again next week on the Sunday Shot.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks,
you.
Joe.